Hi friends, I welcome you all here at TNV Academy. In this session, we are going to talk about an international standard ISO 37001 2016 anti-bribery management systems. In this session, we shall cover all the requirements of ISO 37001 2016 anti-bribery management systems in detail. Let's discuss about the outcome of this session. After completing this session, you will be able to understand all the requirements of ISO 37001 2016 anti-bribery management systems necessary to support the operations of the standard. Before discussing the standard, let me give you a brief idea about International Organization for Standardization, or ISO in short. ISO is an independent, non governmental international organization with a membership of 167 national standards bodies. Through its members, ISO brings together experts to share knowledge and develop voluntary, consensus based, market relevant international standards that support innovation and provide solutions to global challenges. Now, according to International Organization for Standardization, ISO 37001 2016 Anti-Bribery Management Systems, or ABMS, is the international standard that allows organizations of all types to prevent, detect, and address bribery by adopting an anti-bribery policy, appointing a person to oversee anti-bribery compliance, training, risk assessments, and due diligence on projects and business associates, implementing financial and commercial controls, and instituting reporting and investigation procedures. Providing a globally recognized way to address a destructive criminal activity that turns over $1 trillion of dirty money each year. ISO 37001 addresses one of the world's most destructive and challenging issues head on and demonstrates a committed approach to stamping out corruption. Let's have a general introduction of bribery and the need of anti-bribery management system. According to the ISO 37001 2016, bribery is a widespread phenomenon. It raises serious social, moral, economic, and political concerns, undermines good governance, hinders development, and distorts competition. It erodes justice, undermines human rights, and is an obstacle to the relief of poverty. It also increases the cost of doing business, introduces uncertainties into commercial transitions, increases the cost of goods and services, diminishes the quality of products and services, which can lead to loss of life and property, destroys trust in institutions, and interferes with the fair and efficient operation of markets. Governments have made progress in addressing bribery through international agreements such as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Convention on Combating Bribery of Foreign Public Officials in International Business Transactions and the United Nations Convention against Corruption and through their national laws. In most jurisdictions, it is an offense for individuals to engage in bribery, and there is a growing trend to make organizations, as well as individuals, liable for bribery. However, the law alone is not sufficient to solve this problem. Organizations have a responsibility to proactively contribute to combating bribery. This can be achieved by an anti bribery management system, which this document is intended to provide, and through leadership commitment to establishing a culture of integrity, transparency, openness, and compliance. The nature of an organization's culture is critical to the success or failure of an anti bribery management system. A well managed organization is expected to have a compliance policy supported by appropriate management systems to assist it in complying with its legal obligations and commitment to integrity. An anti-bribery policy is a component of an overall compliance policy. The anti-bribery policy and supporting management system help an organization to avoid or mitigate the costs, risks, and damage of involvement in bribery, to promote trust and confidence in business dealings, and to enhance its reputation. ISO 37001 2016 reflects international good practice and can be used in all jurisdictions. It is applicable to small, medium, and large organizations in all sectors, including public, private, and not for profit sectors. The bribery risks facing an organization vary according to factors such as the size of the organization, the location and sectors in which the organization operates, and the nature, scale, and complexity of the organization's activities. The standard specifies the implementation by the organization of policies, procedures, and controls which are reasonable and proportionate according to the bribery risks the organization faces. Annex A provides guidance on implementing the requirements of this document. Conformity with this standard cannot provide assurance that no bribery has occurred or will occur in relation to the organization, as it is not possible to completely eliminate the risk of bribery. However, this document can help the organization implement reasonable and proportionate measures designed to prevent, detect, and respond to bribery. ISO 37001 2016 conforms to ISO's requirements for management system standards. These requirements include a high-level structure, identical core text, and common terms with core definitions designed to benefit users implementing multiple ISO management system standards. This document can be used in conjunction with other management system standards. Example, ISO 9001, ISO 14001, ISO IEC 27001, and ISO 19600, and management standards, example ISO 26000 and ISO 31000. Coming to the coverage part now, we shall cover the following clauses of the standard in this session: scope, normative references, terms and definitions, context of the organization, leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation. Let's start with the scope clause of ISO 37001 2016. According to the scope clause of ISO 37001 2016, it states that the standard specifies requirements and provides guidance for establishing, implementing, maintaining, reviewing, and improving an anti-bribery management systems, or ABMS in short. The ABMS can be standalone or can be integrated into an overall management system. ISO 37001 addresses the following in relation to the organization's activities: bribery in public, private, and not-for-profit sectors, bribery by the organization, bribery by the organization's personnel acting on the organization's behalf or for its benefit, bribery by the organization's business associates acting on the organization's behalf or for its benefit, bribery of the organization, bribery of the organization's personnel in relation to the organization's activities, bribery of the organization's business associates in relation to the organization's activities, direct and indirect bribery. Example, a bribe offered or accepted through or by a third party. Scope specifies that this standard is applicable only to bribery. It sets out requirements and provides guidance for a management system designed to help an organization to prevent, detect, and respond to bribery and comply with anti-bribery laws and voluntary commitments applicable to its activities. This standard does not specifically address fraud, money laundering, or other activities related to corrupt practices, although an organization can choose to extend the scope of the management system to include such activities. This clause says that the requirements of this standard are generic and are intended to be applicable to all organizations or parts of an organization, regardless of type, size, and nature of activity, and whether in the public, private, or not for profit sectors. It is specified in the scope that the extent of application of these requirements depends on the factors specified in clause 4.1, 4.2, and 4.5 of the standard. Coming to the normative references under ISO 37001-2016. As per standard, there are no normative references in this document. We come forward now to the clause 3, terms and definitions of ISO 37001-2016. Before explaining the terms and definitions applicable for the purposes of this standard, let me tell you that ISO and IEC maintain terminological databases for use in standardization, the URLs of which can be seen here on the screen. You are recommended to visit these websites for more information about the terms and definitions used in various standards. Now let me cover the terms one by one as specified in ISO 37001-2016. 3.1 Bribery. Bribery. Bribery is basically offering, promising, giving, accepting, or soliciting of an undue advantage of any value, which could be financial or non-financial, directly or indirectly, and irrespective of location, in violation of applicable law as an inducement or reward for a person acting or refraining from acting in relation to the performance of that person's duties. This is a generic definition. The meaning of the term bribery is as defined by the anti-bribery law applicable to the organization and by the anti-bribery management system designed by the organization. Organization. Organization is a person or group of people that has its own functions with responsibilities, authorities, and relationships to achieve its objectives. The concept of organization includes, but is not limited to sole trader, company, corporation, firm, enterprise, authority, partnership, charity, or institution, or part or combination thereof, whether incorporated or not, public or private. The standard states that for organizations with more than one operating unit, one or more of the operating units can be defined as an organization. Interested party, preferred term, stakeholder, admitted term. Interested party is a person or an organization that can be affected by, or perceive itself to be affected by a decision or activity. A stakeholder can be internal or external to the organization. Requirement. Requirement is the need that is stated and obligatory. The core definition of requirement in ISO management system standards is need or expectation that is stated, generally implied or obligatory. Generally implied requirements are not applicable in the context of anti-bribery management, whereas generally implied here means that it is custom or common practice for the organization and interested parties that the need or expectation under consideration is implied. A specified requirement is one that is stated, for example, in documented information. Management system. Management system is a set of interrelated or interacting elements of an organization to establish policies and objectives and processes to achieve those objectives. A management system can address a single discipline or several disciplines. Top management. Top management is a person or group of people who directs and controls an organization at the highest level. For example, directors, proprietors, and founders, etc. Top management has the power to delegate authority and provide resources within the organization. Governing body. Governing body is a group or body that has the ultimate responsibility and authority for an organization's activities, governance, and policies, and to which top management reports and by which top management is held accountable. Anti bribery compliance function. It is a person with responsibility and authority for the operation of the anti bribery management system. Effectiveness. Effectiveness is the extent to which planned activities are realized and planned results achieved. Policy. Policy is an intention and direction of an organization as formally expressed by its top management or its governing body. Objective. Objective here means the result to be achieved. An objective can be strategic, tactical, or operational. Objectives can relate to different disciplines such as financial, sales and marketing, procurement, health and safety, and environmental goals, and can apply at different levels, such as strategic organization, wide project, product, and process. An objective can be expressed in other ways, example, as an intended outcome, a purpose, an operational criterion, as an anti-bribery objective, or by the use of other words with similar meaning, example, aim, goal, or target. Note 4 to entry. In the context of anti-bribery management systems, anti-bribery objectives are set by the organization, consistent with the anti-bribery policy, to achieve specific results. Risk. Risk means effect of uncertainty on objectives. An effect is a deviation from the expected, positive or negative. Risk is often characterized by reference to potential events and consequences. Competence. Competence is an ability to apply knowledge and skills to achieve intended results. Documented information. Documented information is information required to be controlled and maintained by an organization and the medium on which it is contained. Documented information can be in any format and media and from any source. Process. Process is a set of interrelated or interacting activities which transform inputs into outputs. Performance. Performance means measurable result. Performance can relate either to quantitative or qualitative findings. Performance can relate to the management of activities, processes, products, including services, systems, or organizations. Outsource. Outsource is to make an arrangement where an external organization performs part of an organization's function or process. It is to note here that an external organization is outside the scope of the management system, although the outsourced function or process is within the scope. Monitoring. Monitoring is basically determining the status of a system, a process, or an activity. Measurement. Measurement is a process to determine a value. Audit. Audit is a systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining audit evidence and evaluating it objectively to determine the extent to which the audit criteria are fulfilled. An audit can be an internal audit, first party, or an external audit, second party, or third party, and it can be a combined audit, combining two or more disciplines. An internal audit is conducted by the organization itself or by an external party on its behalf. Conformity. Conformity is the fulfillment of a requirement. Non-conformity. Non-conformity is non-fulfillment of a requirement. Corrective action. Corrective action is an action to eliminate the cause of a non-conformity and to prevent recurrence. Continual improvement. Continual improvement is recurring activity to enhance performance. Personnel. According to the standard, personnel mean organizations' directors, officers, employees, temporary staff or workers, and volunteers. Different types of personnel pose different types and degrees of bribery risk and can be treated differently by the organization's bribery risk assessment and bribery risk management procedures. Business associate. Business associate is an external party with whom the organization has or plans to establish some form of business relationship. As per the standard, business associate includes but is not limited to clients, customers, joint ventures, joint venture partners, consortium partners, outsourcing providers, contractors, consultants, subcontractors, suppliers, vendors, advisors, agents, distributors, representatives, intermediaries, and investors. This definition is deliberately broad and should be interpreted in line with the bribery risk profile of the organization to apply to business associates, which can reasonably expose the organization to bribery risks. Public official. Public official is a person holding a legislative, administrative, or judicial office, whether by appointment, election, or succession, or any person exercising a public function, including an public agency or public enterprise, or any official or agent of a public domestic or international organization, or any candidate for public office. Third party. Third party is a person or body that is independent of the organization. Examples of third party are vendor, contractors, suppliers, etc. Conflict of interest. Conflict of interest is a situation where business, financial, family, political, or personal interests could interfere with the judgment of persons in carrying out their duties for the organization. Due diligence. Due diligence is a process to further assess the nature and extent of the bribery risk and help organizations make decisions in relation to specific transactions, projects, activities, business associates, and personnel. Let's start with the clause 4 context of the organization of ISO 37001 2016 now. Clause 4 of ISO 37001 2016 has 5 sub clauses, which are 4.1 Understanding the organization and its context, 4.2 Understanding the needs and expectations of stakeholders, 4.3 Determining the scope of the anti-bribery management system, 4.4 Anti-bribery management system, 4.5 Bribery risk assessment. Let me start with the subclause 4.1 Understanding the organization and its context. According to the subclause 4.1 of ISO 37001 2016, the standard states that the organization must determine external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose and that affect its ability to achieve the objective of its anti-bribery management system. Let us talk here about the external and internal contexts. This requirement of clause 4.1 can seem too general, and there is a threat of going too wide when defining the internal and external issues. In fulfilling this clause, organizations should emphasize only on issues that can affect the consumer satisfaction and delivery of quality products and or services. An organization's internal context is the environment in which it targets to achieve its objectives. Internal context can include its approach to governance, its contractual relationships with customers, and its interested parties. Things that need to be considered are related to culture, philosophies, ethics, or ideologies inside the organization, as well as complexity of processes and organizational structure. To determine external context, organization should consider issues arising from its social, technological, environmental, ethical, political, legal, and economic environment. Some examples of external context may include government regulations and changes in the law, economic shifts in the organization's market, the organization's competition, events that may affect corporate image, changes in technology, etc. Basically, all this information is with the top and other senior members of management, but it is usually not written on paper. The best way to gather it is by organizing some brainstorming sessions. Arrangement of all this information can be very valuable and validate where you stand as an organization. We should include some of the internal context as well, but are not limited to. Some of the examples of internal issues are structure of the organization, which has limited flexibility when dealing with varying demands. Availability of reliable, qualified, and competent workforce, which is very positive. Stability of workforce, where wage benchmarking is not consistent with competitors. Staff retention, which is also very high positive. Contractual arrangements with customer, which is beneficial to organization. Payment terms from customers provides high credit. Solvency of customers and expansion of customer base also play an important role. The culture within the organization is equally important internal factor. Coming back to the clause 4.1, this clause says that these internal and external issues will include, without limitation, important factors like the size, structure, and delegated decision making authority of the organization, and the locations and sectors in which the organization operates or anticipates operating. Subclause 4.1 specifies that issues will comprise of the nature, scale, and complexity of the organization's activities and operations, and also the business model of the organization. This clause states that the organization must include entities over which the organization has control and entities which exercise control over the organization while determining the internal and external issues. According to subclause 4.1, the organization must contain organization's business associates, the nature and extent of interactions with public officials while determining external and internal issues. Clause specifies that organization must include applicable statutory, regulatory, contractual, and professional obligations and duties while determining the issues. Clause 4.1 stresses through a note and that an organization has control over another organization if it directly or indirectly controls the management of the organization. Let's talk about subclause 4.2, understanding the needs and expectations of stakeholders. The subclause 4.2 states that the organization must determine the stakeholders that are relevant to the anti-bribery management system and the relevant requirements of these stakeholders. The definition of stakeholders is already explained under clause 3 of the standard. Some of the examples of stakeholders are customers, employees, governments, investors, shareholders, suppliers, and vendors, etc. Let me explain the subclause 4.2. The clause 4.2 of ISO 37001-2016 states that the organization must determine relevant stakeholders and relevant requirements of appropriate concerned parties. Relevant interested parties to be considered are those that could affect or potentially affect the organization's ability to constantly provide products and services that meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. Monitor and review information related to interested parties and relevant requirements. Firstly, the organization will need to define external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose. That is, what are the relevant issues, both inside and out, that have an influence on what the organization does, that would affect its capability to accomplish the intended outcomes of its management system. It should be noted that the term issue covers not only problems which would have been the subject of the precautionary action in previous standards, but also important topics for the management system to address, such as any market assurance and governance goals that the organization might set for its management system. Next, the organization has to determine relevant interested parties and relevant requirements of relevant interested parties. An interested party is a person or organization that can be affected by, or recognize themselves to be affected by a decision or activity that's within the scope of the management system. There will be those external interested parties that enforce specific legal, regulatory, or contractual requirements in an organization. There may also be requirements specified by internal interested parties, for example, management and staff, permanent and temporary. There is no requirement in this international standard for the organization to consider interested parties which have been determined by the organization not to be relevant to its anti bribery management system. Similarly, there is no requirement to address a particular requirement of a relevant interested party if the organization considers that the requirement is not relevant. Determining what is relevant or not relevant is reliant on whether or not it has an impact on the organization's ability to regularly provide products and services that meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, or the organization's aim to improve consumer satisfaction. The organization can decide to determine supplementary needs and expectations that will assist it to meet its service objectives. However, it is at the organization's choice whether or not to accept additional requirements to satisfy interested parties beyond what is required by this international standard, ISO 37001 2016. At the end, Clause 4.2 stresses under a note that in identifying the requirements of stakeholders, an organization can distinguish between mandatory requirements and the non mandatory expectations of and voluntary commitments to stakeholders. Let me now explain the subclause 4.3, determining the scope of the anti bribery management system of ISO 37001 2016. The subclause 4.3 states that the organization must determine the boundaries and applicability of the anti bribery management system to establish its scope. This clause says that an organization, while determining this scope, must consider the external and internal issues referred to in clause 4.1, the requirements referred to in clause 4.2, and the results of the bribery risk assessment referred to in clause 4.5 of the standard. The subclause 4.2 also specifies that the organization must make available the scope and must maintain scope as documented information stating the services covered by the ABMS and any justification where a requirement of this international standard cannot be applied. Further, it is also stressed in subclause 4.3 of the standard under a note to refer annexure A2 for further guidance. Let's discuss the subclause 4.4 of ISO 37001 2016, which is Anti-Bribery Management System. Subclause 4.4 of ISO 37001 2016 states that the organization must establish, document, implement, maintain, and continually review and, where necessary, improve an anti-bribery management system, including the processes needed and their interactions in accordance with the requirements of this document. This clause further states that the anti-bribery management system must contain measures designed to identify and evaluate the risk of and to prevent, detect, and respond to bribery. It is also specified under Note 1 of the subclause 4.4 that it is not possible to completely eliminate the risk of bribery, and no anti-bribery management system will be capable of preventing and detecting all bribery. This clause 4.4 also says that the anti-bribery management system must be reasonable and proportionate, taking into account the factors referred to in subclause 4.3 of the standard ISO 37001-2016. Finally, under Note 2, subclause 4.4 recommends to refer the annexure A.3 for further guidance. Coming to the subclause 4.5 bribery risk assessment. The subclause 4.5.1 states that the organization must undertake regular bribery risk assessment, which must identify the bribery risks the organization might reasonably anticipate, given the factors listed in subclause 4.1 of the standard. It must analyze, assess, and prioritize the identified bribery risks and must evaluate the suitability and effectiveness of the organization's existing controls to mitigate the assessed bribery risks. The subclause 4.5.2 specifies that the organization must establish criteria for evaluating its level of bribery risk, which must take into account the policies and objectives of the organization. As per subclause 4.5.3, the organization must review the bribery risk assessment on a regular basis so that changes and new information could be properly assessed based on timing and frequency defined by the organization. Organization must also review the bribery risk assessment in the event of a significant change to the structure or activities of the organization. The subclause 4.5.4 of ISO 37001-2016 states that the organization must retain documented information that demonstrates that the bribery risk assessment has been conducted and used to design or improve the anti-bribery management system. At the end of clause 4.5.4, standard recommends to refer annexure A.4 for further guidance. Friends, till now it was all about the clause 4 context of the organization of ISO 37001-2016. And now we proceed to clause 5 leadership of ISO 37001-2016. This clause 5 leadership talks about the role of top management, which is the group of people who direct and control your organization at the highest level. They need to ensure that the ABMS and its requirements are integrated into the organization's processes and the policy and objectives are aligned with the strategic direction of the organization. They also need to make sure that the anti-bribery policy is made available, communicated, maintained, and understood by all parties. The clause 5 leadership is further divided into 3 subclauses, which are 5.1 leadership and commitment, 5.2 anti-bribery policy, 5.3 organizational roles, responsibilities, and authorities. Let's start with the subclause 5.1 leadership and commitment. The subclause 5.1 again has its own 2 subclauses. Subclause 5.1.1 governing body and subclause 5.1.2 top management. The clause 5.1.1 governing body states that when the organization has a governing body, that body must demonstrate leadership and commitment with respect to the anti-bribery management system by approving the organization's anti-bribery policy and ensuring that the organization's strategy and anti-bribery policy are aligned. The governing body must demonstrate leadership and commitment with respect to anti-bribery management system at planned intervals, receiving and reviewing information about the content and operation of the organization's anti-bribery management system. The subclause 5.1.1 specifies that governing body must establish leadership and commitment with respect to anti-bribery management system, requiring that adequate and appropriate resources needed for effective operation of the anti-bribery management system are allocated and assigned. Subclause 5.1.1 also states that governing body must demonstrate leadership and commitment, exercising reasonable oversight over the implementation of the organization's anti-bribery management system by top management and its effectiveness. Standard under subclause 5.1.1 also says that these activities must be carried out by the top management if the organization does not have a governing body. Let's come to subclause 5.1.2, top management. The subclause 5.1.2, top management of ISO 37001 2016 states that the top management must demonstrate leadership and commitment with respect to the anti-bribery management system by ensuring that the anti-bribery management system, including policy and objectives, is established, implemented, maintained, and reviewed to adequately address the organization's bribery risks. Top management must show leadership and commitment with respect to anti-bribery management system by ensuring the integration of the anti-bribery management system requirements into the organization's processes and also deploying adequate and appropriate resources for the effective operation of the anti-bribery management system. The subclause 5.1.2 states that while communicating internally and externally regarding the anti-bribery policy, the top management must determine leadership and commitment with respect to the anti-bribery management system. According to the clause, top management must establish leadership and commitment by communicating internally the importance of effective anti-bribery management and of conforming to the anti-bribery management system requirements. The top management must establish the leadership and commitment by ensuring that the anti-bribery management system is appropriately designed to achieve its objectives and also by directing and supporting personnel to contribute to the effectiveness of the anti-bribery management system. Subclause 5.1.2 states that by promoting an appropriate anti-bribery culture within the organization and promoting continual improvement, top management could demonstrate leadership and commitment with respect to the anti-bribery management system. The clause 5.1.2 also specifies that it's responsibility of top management to determine leadership and commitment by supporting other relevant management roles to demonstrate their leadership in preventing and detecting bribery as it applies to their areas of responsibility. It is stated under subclause 5.1.2 that the top management must establish leadership by encouraging the use of reporting procedures for suspected and actual bribery. Clause refers to study clause 8.9 of the standard for more information about it. Clause 5.1.2 specifies that top management must show leadership and commitment with respect to anti-bribery management system by ensuring that no personnel will suffer retaliation, discrimination, or disciplinary action as described under subclause 7.2.2.1d for reports made in good faith or on the basis of a reasonable belief of violation or suspected violation of the organization's anti-bribery policy, or for refusing to engage in bribery even if such refusal can result in the organization losing business, except where the individual participated in the violation. The clause 5.1.2 states that with respect to anti-bribery management system, top management must show leadership and commitment at planned intervals, reporting to the governing body, if any, on the content and operation of the anti-bribery management system and of allegations of serious or systematic bribery. It is also a recommendation under this clause as a note to see annexure A.5 for guidance. Let's talk now about Subclause 5.2 Anti-Bribery Policy. The Subclause 5.2 Anti-Bribery Policy states that the top management must establish, maintain, and review an anti-bribery policy that prohibits bribery and requires compliance with anti-bribery laws that are applicable to the organization. The policy must be appropriate to the purpose of the organization and must provide a framework for setting, reviewing, and achieving anti bribery objectives. Subclause 5.2 says that the anti bribery policy must include a commitment to satisfy anti bribery management system requirements. The policy must encourage raising concerns in good faith or on the basis of a reasonable belief in confidence without fear of reprisal. As per clause, anti-bribery policy must contain a commitment to continual improvement of the anti-bribery management system and must be comprehensive to explain the authority and independence of the anti-bribery compliance function. The subclause 5.2 states that the top management must establish, maintain, and review an anti bribery policy that explains the consequences of not complying with the anti bribery policy. The anti bribery policy must be available as documented information and must be communicated in appropriate languages within the organization and to business associates who pose more than a low risk of bribery. As per clause 5.2 of ISO 37001 2016, the anti bribery policy must be available to relevant stakeholders as appropriate. Let's come to the subclause 5.3 Organizational Roles, Responsibilities, and Authorities. The subclause 5.3 has further three subclauses. These are 5.3.1 Roles and Responsibilities, 5.3.2 Anti-Bribery Compliance Function, 5.3.3 Delegated Decision Making. Let me begin with subclause 5.3.1 Roles and Responsibilities. The subclause 5.3.1 of ISO 37001 2016 specifies that the top management must have overall responsibility for the implementation of and compliance with the anti-bribery management system as described in subclause 5.1.2 of the standard. As per this subclause 5.3.1, top management must ensure that the responsibilities and authorities for relevant roles are assigned and communicated within and throughout every level of the organization. According to the clause, managers at every level must be responsible for requiring that the anti-bribery management system requirements are applied and complied within their department or function. The governing body, if any, top management, and all other personnel must be responsible for understanding, complying with, and applying the anti bribery management system requirements as they relate to their role in the organization. Coming now to the subclause 5.3.2 Anti Bribery Compliance Function. This clause says that the top management must assign to an anti bribery compliance function the responsibility and authority for overseeing the design and implementation by the organization of the anti bribery management system. As per subclause 5.3.2, top management must assign to an anti bribery compliance function that the responsibility and authority for providing advice and guidance to personnel on the anti bribery management system and issues relating to bribery. The responsibility and authority must be assigned to an anti bribery compliance function for ensuring that the anti bribery management system conforms to the requirements of the standard. Top management must also assign the responsibility and authority to an anti bribery compliance function for reporting on the performance of the anti bribery management system to the governing body, if any, and top management other compliance functions as appropriate. Subclause 5.3.2 of ISO 37001-2016 states that the anti-bribery compliance function must be adequately resourced and assigned to persons who have the appropriate competence, status, authority, and independence. The anti-bribery compliance function must have direct and prompt access to the governing body, if any, and top management in the event that any issue or concern needs to be raised in relation to bribery or the anti-bribery management system. It is also mentioned under this subclause 5.3.2 that the top management can assign some or all of the anti-bribery compliance function to persons external to the organization. If it does, top management shall ensure that specific personnel have responsibility for and authority over those externally assigned parts of the function. At the end of subclause 5.3.2, standard stresses on a note to refer the annexure A.6 for guidance. Let us discuss the last subclause 5.3.3 of ISO 37001-2016, Delegated Decision Making. This clause 5.3.3 simply states that where top management delegates to personnel the authority for the making of decisions in relation to which there is more than a low risk of bribery, the organization must establish and maintain a decision making process or set of controls which requires that the decision process and the level of authority of the decision makers are appropriate and free of actual or potential conflicts of interest. The top management of the organization must ensure that these processes are reviewed periodically as part of its role and responsibility for implementation of and compliance with the anti-bribery management system outlined in subclause 5.3.1. This subclause 5.3.3 also states that delegation of decision making does not exempt top management or the governing body, if any, of their duties and responsibilities as described in subclause 5.1.1, 5.1.2, and 5.3.1, nor does it necessarily transfer to the delegated personnel potential legal responsibilities. Friends, this was all about Clause 5, Leadership and Commitment of ISO 37001-2016, Anti-Bribery Management System. Now, let us discuss about the Clause 6, Planning. This Clause 6, Planning, on how an organization plans actions to address both risks and opportunities. Consideration of risks needs to be proportionate to the potential impact they may have, and organizations may decide to categorize risks into different levels from low to high. If an activity is determined to be high risk and that the organization cannot manage it, then it should not be undertaken. The Clause 6 planning has two subclauses. Subclause 6.1, actions to address risks and opportunities, and Subclause 6.2, anti-bribery objectives and planning to achieve them. Let me give you the insights of Subclause 6.1, actions to address risks and opportunities. The subclause 6.1 of ISO 37001-2016 states that when planning for the anti-bribery management system, the organization must consider the issues referred to in subclause 4.1, the requirements referred to in subclause 4.2, the risks identified in subclause 4.5, and opportunities for improvement that need to be addressed to give reasonable assurance that the anti-bribery management system can achieve its objectives. As per subclause 6.1, the organization must consider issues, requirements, risks, and opportunities that need to be addressed to prevent or reduce undesired effects relevant to the anti-bribery policy and objectives. and also to monitor the effectiveness of the anti-bribery management system. It is also a need of the organization to achieve continual improvement. The organization must plan actions to address these bribery risks and opportunities for improvement, and how to integrate and implement these actions into its anti bribery management system processes, and to evaluate the effectiveness of these actions. Let's now talk about subclause 6.2 anti bribery objectives and planning to achieve them. Subclause 6.2 of ISO 37001-2016 says that the organization must establish anti-bribery management system objectives at relevant functions and levels. The anti-bribery management system objectives must be consistent with the anti-bribery policy and be measurable if practicable. It must take into account applicable factors referred to in subclause 4.1, the requirements referred to in subclause 4.2, and the bribery risks identified in the subclause 4.5. As per subclause 6.2, anti-bribery management system must be achievable, monitored, to be communicated in accordance with subclause 7.4, and must be updated as appropriate. It is also mentioned under mandatory documentation requirements that the organization must retain documented information on the anti-bribery management system objectives. According to this subclause 6.2, the standard says that when planning achieving its anti-bribery management system objectives, the organization must determine the following: what will be done, what resources will be required, who will be responsible, when the objectives will be achieved, how the results will be evaluated and reported, and who will impose sanctions or penalties. Friends, we have covered the clause 6 planning of ISO 37001-2016 now. Let's discuss the clause 7 support. This clause of ISO 37001 is all about getting the right resources, the right people, and the right infrastructure in place to maintain and improve the anti-bribery management system. This includes identifying the necessary competencies of the people delivering work that affect the organization's anti-bribery performance. As per clause, documented information needs to be kept to provide evidence of this. The clause 7 has 5 subclauses, which are 7.1 resources, 7.2 competence, 7.3 awareness and training, 7.4 communication, 7.5 documented information. Let me start with subclause 7.1 resources. The subclause 7.1 of ISO 37001-2016 states that the organization must determine and provide the resources needed for the establishment, implementation, maintenance, and continual improvement of the anti-bribery management system. As per the clause 7.1, the requirements are to check that organization has identified which resources it needs to make available in order to ensure the effective operation of the ABMS. Resources will often include raw materials, infrastructure, finance, personnel, and ICT, all of which can be either internally or externally provided. Having sufficient resources is vital to ensure service conformity and satisfy the customer requirements. Example, having adequate workforces, finance, and equipment to ensure timely delivery of services. Many organizations run into ABMS non-conformities as a result of insufficient or improper use of resources. The organization should identify the internal and external resources that are needed for the achievement of the organization's objectives in the short and long term. The organization's policies and methods for resource management should be consistent with its strategy. As part of its strategy planning, top management must decide what resources it must develop, acquire, or outsource to be competitive. Due to the ever changing dynamics of the business environment, these resources and competitive advantages must be constantly upgraded or altered to enable your organization to maintain its competitive advantage relative to other firms. To ensure that resources such as equipment, infrastructural facilities, materials, knowledge, finance, and workers are used effectively and efficiently, it is necessary to have ABMS processes in place to provide, allocate, monitor, evaluate, optimize, maintain, and protect those resources. Auditors may look at the budget to check that some funding has been allocated to the ABMS, but they might dig deeper, checking if the organization has really identified all types of resources required and that it has taken action to ensure that those resources are available as needed. Under this clause 7.1, it is also recommended to read Annexure A.7 for further guidance. Coming to subclause 7.2, competence. This subclause 7.2 has two subclauses, 7.2.1, general, and 7.2.2, employment process. Competence defines the guidelines that must be followed by all staff in order to be considered competent of the requirements. In other words, this procedure ensures that all employees are performing to their best ability in their specific areas of expertise. We shall discuss about 7.2.1 general now. According to the subclause 7.2.1 general, standard specifies that the organization must determine the necessary competence of person or persons doing work under its control that affects its anti-bribery performance and to ensure that these persons are competent on the basis of appropriate education, training, or experience. As per clause 7.2.1, the organization must take actions to acquire and maintain the necessary competence and evaluate the effectiveness of the actions taken where applicable. To meet the requirement of the standard, it is specified under this subclause 7.2.1 that the organization must retain appropriate documented information as evidence of competence. So keep documented your competence, training, and awareness process. And since the competency of your staff is vital to achieving product and service conformance, you should always look to define and control this process. The implementation of a competence, training, and awareness procedure should be a priority of all businesses. The subclause 7.2.1 mentions under a note that applicable actions can include, for example, the provision of training, coaching, or the reassignment of personnel or business associates, or the hiring or contracting of the same. Coming to the subclause 7.2.2, employment process. Clause 7.2.2 says that in relation to all of its personnel, the organization must implement procedures such that conditions of employment require personnel to comply with the anti-bribery policy and anti-bribery management system and give the organization the right to discipline personnel in the event of non-compliance. The organization must implement procedures within a reasonable period of their employment commencing, and personnel receive a copy of the anti-bribery policy and training in relation to that policy, or are provided with access to the anti-bribery policy. Subclause 7.2.2 states that the organization must have procedures which enable them to take appropriate disciplinary action against personnel who violate the anti-bribery policy or anti-bribery management system. This clause says that the personnel will not suffer retaliation, discrimination, or disciplinary action, example by threats, isolation, demotion, preventing advancement, transfer, dismissal, bullying, victimization, or other forms of harassment, for refusing to participate in or turning down any activity in respect of which they have reasonably judged there to be a more than low risk of bribery that has not been mitigated by the organization. The concerns raised or reports made in good faith or on the basis of a reasonable belief of attempted, actual, or suspected bribery or violation of the anti bribery policy or the anti bribery management system, except where the individual participated in the violation. As per 7.2.2.2, it is stated in standard that in relation to all positions which are exposed to more than low bribery risk, as determined in the bribery risk management described under subclause 4.5 and to the anti-bribery compliance function, the organization must implement procedures which provide that due diligence as specified under subclause 8.2 is conducted on persons before they are employed and on personnel before they are transferred or promoted by the organization to ascertain as far as is reasonable that it is appropriate to employ or redeploy them and that it is reasonable to believe that they will comply with the anti-bribery policy and anti-bribery management system requirements. Subclause 7.2.2.2 also specifies that performance bonuses, performance targets, and other incentivizing elements of remuneration are reviewed periodically to verify that there are reasonable safeguards in place to prevent them from encouraging bribery. According to this clause, such personnel, top management, and the governing body, if any, file a declaration at reasonable intervals proportionate with the identified bribery risk, confirming their compliance with the anti bribery policy. At the end of clause 7.2.2.2, it has been stressed under note 1 that the anti-bribery compliance declaration can stand alone or be a component of a broader compliance declaration process. It is also a recommendation under note 2 to refer annexure A.8 for guidance. Now, coming to the subclause 7.3, awareness and training of ISO 37001-2016. This subclause 7.3, awareness and training of ISO 37001-2016, states that the organization must provide adequate and appropriate anti-bribery awareness and training to the personnel. Such training must address the appropriate issues taking into account the results of the bribery risk assessment. It is also recommended here in clause to refer to subclause 4.5 for more information about risk assessment. Let me now talk about those appropriate issues which must be taken into account, the results of the bribery risk assessment. These are the organization's anti-bribery policy, procedures and anti-bribery management system, and their duty to comply. The bribery risk and the damage to them and the organization which can result from bribery. The circumstances in which bribery can occur in relation to their duties and how to recognize these circumstances. How to recognize and respond to solicitations or offers of briberies. How they can help prevent and avoid bribery and recognize key bribery risk indicators. Their contribution to the effectiveness of the anti-bribery management system, including the benefits of improved anti-bribery performance and of reporting suspected bribery. The implications and potential consequences of not conforming with the anti-bribery management system requirements. How and to whom they are able to report any concerns. It is again a recommendation here in this subclause 7.3 to refer to subclause 8.9. Information on available training and resources. Clause 7.3 states that personnel must be provided with anti-bribery awareness and training on a regular basis at a planned interval determined by the organization. Anti-bribery awareness and training to personnel must be as appropriate to their roles, the risks of bribery to which they are exposed to, and any changing circumstances. The awareness and training programs must be periodically updated as necessary to reflect the relevant new information. Subclause 7.3 of ISO 37001 2016 says that taking into account the bribery risks identified, which is described under Subclause 4.5, the organization must also implement procedures addressing to anti-bribery awareness and training for business associates acting on its behalf or for its benefit and which could pose more than a low bribery risk to the organization. These procedures must identify the business associates for which such awareness and training is necessary, its content, and the means by which the training shall be provided. Further, to meet the mandatory documentation requirements, the subclause 7.3 specifies that the organization must retain documented information on the training procedures, the content of the training, and when and to whom it was provided. Finally, under this subclause 7.3, it is stressed under Note 1 that the awareness and training requirements for business associates can be communicated through contractual or similar requirements and be implemented by the organization, the business associate, or by other parties appointed for that purpose. At the end of the subclause 7.3 under Note 2, it is recommended by the standard to study Annexure A.9 for further guidance. Let's talk about subclause 7.4 communication. According to subclause 7.4.1, the organization must establish, implement, and maintain the processes needed for internal and external communications relevant to the anti-bribery management system. The organization must determine what it will communicate, when to communicate, with whom to communicate, and how to communicate, and who will be responsible for the communication along with the languages in which communication is to be done. While establishing its communication processes, the organization must take into account its compliance obligations and ensure that anti-bribery management information communicated is steady with information generated within the anti-bribery management system and is reliable. The organization must respond to relevant communication on its anti-bribery management system. As appropriate, the organization must retain documented information as evidence of its communication. Clause 7.4 communication refers to all types of communications, both internal and external, to the organization. It requires organizations to establish and maintain a process for internal communication between the various levels and functions of the organization. It also requires organizations to document and respond to relevant communication from external interested parties. One of the examples of internal communication includes communicating anti-bribery management objectives and targets to the employees. Another example of internal communication is communicating the ABMS policy and raising awareness of anti-bribery management issues to the employees. Advising of non-conformance to relevant departmental heads also falls under examples of internal communication. The subclause 7.4.2 of the standard, the anti-bribery policy, must be made available to all the organization's personnel and business associates, be communicated directly to both personnel and business associates who pose more than a low risk of bribery, and shall be published through the organization's internal and external communication channels as appropriate. We shall now discuss the subclause 7.5, documented information of ISO 37001-2016. This subclause has been divided into three subclauses. Subclause 7.5.1 General, Subclause 7.5.2 Creating and Updating, Subclause 7.5.3 Control of Documented Information. Let's start with discussing Subclause 7.5.1 General. As per Subclause 7.5.1, the organization's anti-bribery management system must include documented information required by this standard and also the documented information determined by the organization as being necessary for the effectiveness of the anti-bribery management system. Under Note 1 of Subclause 7.5.1, it is specified that the extent of documented information for an anti-bribery management system can differ from one organization to another due to the size of organization and its type of activities, processes, products, and services. It could also be differed due to the complexity of the processes and their interactions and the competence of personnel. Under Note 2, it is stated that the documented information can be retained separately as part of the anti-bribery management system or can be retained as part of other management systems. Example, compliance, financial, commercial, audit. Subclause 7.5.1 also recommends under Note 3 to refer annexure A.17 of the standard for further guidance. Let's start now Subclause 7.5.2, Creating and Updating. The Subclause 7.5.2 states that when creating and updating documented information, the organization must ensure appropriate identification and description. Example, a title, date, author, or reference number, and the format. Example, language, software version, graphics, and media where information is stored. Example, paper or electronic. As per Clause 7.5.2, the organization must ensure appropriate review of documented information and approval for its suitability and adequacy. Coming to the subclause 7.5.3, Control of Documented Information. This subclause 7.5.3 states that the documented information required by the anti-bribery management system and by this document must be controlled to ensure that it is available and suitable for use where and when it is needed. It is also specified under subclause 7.5.3 that the documented information is adequately protected from loss of confidentiality, improper use, or loss of integrity, etc. As per subclause 7.5.3, for controlling of documented information, the organization must address the appropriate activities as applicable. Examples of those activities are distribution, access, retrieval and use, storage and preservation, including preservation of legibility, control of changes, example, version control, retention and disposition. According to this subclause, documented information of external origin determined by the organization to be necessary for the planning and operation of the anti-bribery management system must be identified as appropriate and controlled. At the end of the subclause 7.5.3, standard states under note that access can imply a decision regarding the permission to view the documented information only or the permission and authority to view and change the documented information. Friends, till now it was about the clause 7 support of ISO 37001-2016. Now we shall start discussing the clause 8 operation of ISO 37001-2016. The clause 8 of ISO 37001-2016 covers about the planning and control of ISO 37001 and covers due diligence, financial controls, and non financial controls. This clause is designed to help an organization establish, implement, maintain, and improve an anti bribery compliance program. The Clause 8 includes a series of measures and controls that represent global anti bribery good practice. The standard is flexible and can be adapted to a wide range of organizations, including large organizations, small and medium sized enterprises, SMEs, public and private sector organizations, non governmental organizations, NGOs, etc. The Clause 8 operation of ISO 37001 2016 has 10 subclauses, which are 8.1 Operational Planning and Control, 8.2 Due Diligence, 8.3 Financial Controls, 8.4 Non Financial Controls, 8.5 Implementation of Anti Bribery Controls by controlled organizations and by business associates, 8.6 Anti Bribery Commitments, 8.7 Gifts, Hospitality, Donations, and Similar Benefits, 8.8 Managing Inadequacy of Anti Bribery Controls, 8.9 Raising Concerns, 8.10 Investigating and Dealing with Bribery. Let me start with subclause 8.1 Operational Planning and Control. The subclause 8.1 Operational Planning and Control of ISO 37001 2016 states that the organization must plan, implement, review, and control the processes needed to meet requirements of the anti bribery management system and to implement the actions determined in the subclause 6.1 by establishing criteria for the processes, implementing control of the processes in accordance with the criteria, and keeping documented information to the extent necessary to have confidence that the processes have been carried out as planned. Clause 8.1 says that these processes must include the specific controls referred to in subclause 8.2 to 8.10 of the standard. Subclause 8.1 specifies that the organization must control planned changes and review the consequences of unintended changes, taking action to mitigate any adverse effects as necessary. The organization must also ensure that outsourced processes are controlled. This subclause 8.1 mentions under a note that the core text of ISO management system standards contains a requirement in relation to outsourcing, which is not used in this document, and outsourcing providers are included within the definition of business associate. Coming to the subclause 8.2 due diligence. The subclause 8.2 of ISO 37001 2016 states that where the organization's bribery risk assessment, as conducted in subclause 4.5, has assessed a more than low bribery risk in relation to specific categories of transactions, projects, or activities, planned or ongoing relationships with specific categories of business associates, or specific categories of personnel in certain positions. It is mentioned here in clause 8.2 to refer to subclause 7.2.2.2 for more information. This subclause 8.2 due diligence specifies that the organization must assess the nature and extent of the bribery risk in relation to specific transactions, projects, activities, business associates, and personnel falling within those categories. This assessment must include any due diligence necessary to obtain sufficient information to assess the bribery risk. The due diligence must be updated at a defined frequency so that changes and new information can be properly taken into account. It is mentioned as Note 1 under subclause 8.2 that the organization can include that it is unnecessary, unreasonable, or disproportionate to undertake due diligence on certain categories of personnel and business associates. The clause 8.2 stresses on note 2 that the factors listed in A, B, and C above are not exhaustive. At the end of subclause 8.2, the standard recommends under note 3 to refer annexure A.10 for further guidance. Let's have a discussion of subclause 8.3 financial controls of ISO 37001-2016. The subclause 8.3 financial control simply states that the organization must implement financial controls that manage bribery risk. It is also recommended under subclause 8.3 as a note to refer to the annexure A.11 for more guidance. Let's talk about subclause 8.4, non-financial controls. The subclause 8.4 specifies that the organization must implement non-financial controls that manage bribery risk with respect to such areas as procurement, operational, sales, commercial, human resources, legal, and regulatory activities. This clause states under Note 1 that any particular transaction, activity, or relationship can be subject to financial as well as non financial controls. Under Note 2, it has been recommended to refer to annexure A.12 for guidance. Coming to the subclause 8.5, implementation of anti bribery controls by controlled organizations and by business associates. Subclause 8.5.1 of ISO 37001-2016 states that the organization must implement procedures which require that all other organizations over which it has control either implement the organization's anti-bribery management system or implement their own anti-bribery controls. In each case, only to the extent that is reasonable and proportionate with regards to the bribery risks faced by the controlled organizations, taking into account the bribery risk assessment conducted in accordance with subclause 4.5 of the standard. Subclause 8.5.1 under a note states that an organization has control over another organization if it directly or indirectly controls the management of the organization. Under this subclause 8.5.1, it is also recommended to refer annexure A.13.1.3. Now, let me discuss the subclause 8.5.2. This clause says that in relation to business associates not controlled by the organization for which the bribery risk assessment or due diligence has identified a more than low bribery risk and where anti-bribery controls implemented by the business associates would help mitigate the relevant bribery risk. The organization must implement some procedures which I am explaining to you now. The organization must determine whether the business associate has in place anti-bribery controls which manage the relevant bribery risk. Where a business associate does not have in place anti-bribery controls or it is not possible to verify whether it has them in place. Where practicable, the organization must require the business associate to implement anti-bribery controls in relation to the relevant transaction, project, or activity. Or where it is not practicable to require the business associate to implement anti-bribery controls. This must be a factor taken into account in evaluating the bribery risk of the relationship with this business associate and the way in which the organization manages such risks. The subclause 8.5.2 also states as a note to refer to annexure A.13 for guidance. Let us now talk about subclause 8.6, anti-bribery commitments. Where business associates are with more than acceptable or low bribery risk, effective controls and decisions are required, and it may lead to termination of the relationship. Bribery risk assessment is necessary for such situations for evaluating the risk to the organization. Subclause 8.6a says that for business associates which pose more than a low bribery risk, the organization must implement procedures which require that, as far as practicable, business associates commit to preventing bribery by, on behalf of, or for the benefit of the business associate in connection with the relevant transaction, project, activity, or relationship. According to Clause 8.6b, as far as practicable, the organization must also implement procedures which require that the organization is able to terminate the relationship with the business associate in the event of bribery by, on behalf of, or for the benefit of the business associate in connection with the relevant transaction, project, activity, or relationship. This clause specifies that where it is not practicable to meet the requirements of 8.6a or 8.6b here, this must be a factor taken into account in evaluating the bribery risk of the relationship with this business associate and the way in which the organization manages such risks. Clause 8.6 also recommends referring annexure A.14 of the standard for further guidance. Coming to subclause 8.7, gifts, hospitality, donations, and similar benefits. This clause 8.7 states that the organization must implement procedures that are designed to prevent the offering, provision, or acceptance of gifts, hospitality, donations, and similar benefits where the offering, provision, or acceptance is bribery or could reasonably be perceived as bribery. Referring to annexure A.15 of the standard, it is also recommended as a note under this subclause 8.7 of ISO 37001 2016. Let's talk about subclause 8.8 of ISO 37001 2016, that is, managing inadequacy of anti bribery controls. This clause 8.8 states that where the organization cannot manage bribery risk, the relationship or project or contract is to be reviewed at appropriate stages. It can also be withdrawn or declined as feasible. Subclause 8.8 says that where the due diligence conducted on a specific transaction, project, activity, or relationship with a business associate establishes that the bribery risks cannot be managed by existing anti-bribery controls, organization must take steps appropriate to the bribery risks and the nature of the transaction, project, activity, or relationship to terminate, discontinue, suspend, or withdraw from it as soon as practicable. In the case of an existing transaction, project, activity, or relationship. If the organization cannot or does not wish to implement additional or enhanced anti bribery controls or take other appropriate steps to enable the organization to manage the relevant bribery risks, the organization must postpone or decline to continue with it in the case of a proposed new transaction, project, activity, or relationship. Examples of appropriate steps are such as changing the nature of the transaction, project, activity, or relationship, etc. Coming to subclause 8.9, raising concerns. The subclause 8.9a states that the organization must implement procedures which encourage and enable persons to report in good faith or on the basis of a reasonable belief attempted, suspected, and actual bribery or any violation of or weakness in the anti bribery management system to the anti bribery compliance function or to appropriate personnel. As per clause, it could be either directly or through an appropriate third party. Subclause 8.9b states that the organization must implement procedures except to the extent required to progress an investigation, require that the organization treats reports confidentially so as to protect the identity of the reporter and of others involved or referenced in the report. Subclause 8.9c says that procedure must allow anonymous reporting, and as per the subclause 8.9d, it prohibits retaliation and protect those making reports from retaliation after they have in good faith or on the basis of a reasonable belief raised or reported a concern about attempted, actual or suspected bribery or violation of the anti-bribery policy or the anti-bribery management system. Subclause 8.9e states that it must enable personnel to receive advice from an appropriate person on what to do if faced with a concern or situation which could involve bribery. Clause 8.9 also specifies that the organization must ensure that all personnel are aware of the reporting procedures and are able to use them, and are aware of their rights and protections under the procedures. Under Note 1, clause states that the procedures can be the same as or form part of those used for the reporting of other issues of concern. The examples of concerns are safety, malpractice, wrongdoing, or other serious risk, etc. Under Note 2, clause says that the organization can use a business associate to manage the reporting system on its behalf. And under Note 3, it has been stated by the clause 8.9 that in some jurisdictions, the requirements in 8.9b and 8.9c are prohibited by law. In these cases, the organization documents its inability to comply. Let's talk about the subclause 8.10, investigating and dealing with bribery. This subclause 8.10 of ISO 37001-2016 states that the organization must implement procedures that require assessment and, where appropriate, investigation of any bribery or violation of the anti-bribery policy or the anti-bribery management system, which is reported, detected, or reasonably suspected. As per this clause, the organization must implement procedures that require appropriate action in the event that the investigation reveals any bribery or violation of the anti-bribery policy or the anti-bribery management system. According to the subclause 8.10, the procedures require empowering and enabling investigators and require cooperation in the investigation by relevant personnel. The clause also says that organization must implement procedures that require that the status and the results of the investigation are reported to the anti-bribery compliance function and other compliance functions as appropriate. The procedures also require that the investigation is carried out confidentially and that the outputs of the investigation are confidential. As per clause 8.10, the investigation must be carried out by and reported to personnel who are not part of the role or function being investigated. The organization can appoint a business associate to conduct the investigation and report the results to personnel who are not part of the role or function being investigated. Finally, it is recommended under Note 1 to refer annexure A.18 for additional guidance. And under Note 2, clause also says that in some jurisdictions, the requirement in 8.10f is prohibited by law. In this case, the organization documents its inability to comply. Friends, it was all about clause 8 till now, operation of ISO 37001-2016. Now we shall discuss Clause 9, Performance Evaluation. The Clause 9 of ISO 37001:2016 is about measuring and evaluating anti-bribery management system to ensure that it is effective and it helps organization to maintain a robust anti-bribery management system. Organization will need to consider what should be measured, the methods employed, and when data should be analyzed and reported on. Correspondingly, an internal audit shall be held in order to provide information whether the anti-bribery system is conforming to the organization's requirements and international standard requirements. In order to understand whether the anti-bribery management system is adequate to manage effectively the bribery risks confronted by the organization and whether it is effectively implemented, the organization shall review and report at planned intervals to the top management the adequacy of implementation and the results of investigation audits of anti-bribery management system. The clause 9 has four subclauses, which are 9.1 Monitoring, Measurement, Analysis, and Evaluation. 9.2 Internal Audit. 9.3 Management Review. 9.4 Review by Anti-Bribery Compliance Function. Let's start with the subclause 9.1 Monitoring, Measurement, Analysis, and Evaluation. The subclause 9.1 states that the organization must determine what needs to be monitored and measured, who is responsible for monitoring, the methods for monitoring, measurement analysis, and evaluation as applicable to ensure valid results, when the monitoring and measuring shall be performed, when the results from monitoring and measurement shall be analyzed and evaluated, to whom and how such information shall be reported. Subclause 9.1 also talks about the mandatory documentation requirements. It says that the organization shall retain appropriate documented information as evidence of the methods and results. The clause also specifies that the organization must evaluate the anti-bribery performance and the effectiveness and efficiency of the anti-bribery management system. Finally, it is recommended in this clause 9.1 under a note to refer annexure A.19 for guidance. Let's discuss subclause 9.2 Internal Audit. The subclause 9.2.1 states that the organization must conduct internal audits at planned intervals to provide information on whether the anti-bribery management system conforming to the organization's own requirements for its anti-bribery management system. The organization must also conduct internal audits at planned intervals to provide information on whether the anti-bribery management system conforming to the requirements of this document. The subclause 9.2.1 also specifies that organization must ensure that internal audit is effectively implemented and maintained. Subclause 9.2.1 recommends as note 1 to refer ISO 19011 to have guidance on auditing management systems. Under note 2, clause also states that the scope and scale of the organization's internal audit activities can vary depending on a variety of factors, including organization size, structure, maturity, and locations. Coming to subclause 9.2.2, this clause says that the organization must plan, establish, implement, and maintain an audit program or programs including the frequency, methods, responsibilities, planning requirements, and reporting, which shall take into consideration the importance of the processes concerned and the results of previous audits. As per subclause 9.2.2, the organization must define the audit criteria and scope for each audit and must select competent auditors and conduct audits to ensure objectivity and the impartiality of the audit process. Subclause 9.2.2 specifies that organization must ensure that the results of the audits are reported to relevant management, the anti-bribery compliance function, top management, and, as appropriate, the governing body, if any. Covering the mandatory documentation requirements of the standard, subclause 9.2.2 states that organization must retain documented information as evidence of the implementation of the audit program and the audit results. Let's talk about subclause 9.2.3. As per this subclause 9.2.3, the standard states that these audits must be reasonable, proportionate, and risk based. Such audits must consist of internal audit processes or other procedures which review procedures, controls, and systems for bribery or suspected bribery, violation of the anti-bribery policy or anti-bribery management system requirements, failure of business associates to conform to the applicable anti-bribery requirements of the organization, and weaknesses in or opportunities for improvement to the anti-bribery management system. Let's talk about subclause 9.2.4. This clause states that the organization must ensure that internal audits are undertaken to ensure the objectivity and impartiality of these audit programs by one of the following: an independent function or personnel established or appointed for this process, or the anti-bribery compliance function unless the scope of the audit includes an evaluation of the anti-bribery management system itself, or similar work for which the anti-bribery compliance function is responsible, or an appropriate person from a department or function other than the one being audited, or an appropriate third party, or a group comprising any of A to D. Subclause 9.2.4 also states that the organization must ensure that no auditor is auditing his or her own area of work. It is also recommended as a note under subclause 9.3.4 to refer to annexure A.16 for guidance. Let's talk about clause 9.3, management review. The subclause 9.3.1, top management review, states that the top management must review the organization's anti-bribery management system at planned intervals to ensure its continuing suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness. Clause 9.3.1 states that the top management review must include consideration of the status of actions from previous management reviews. As per clause 9.3.1, top management review must comprise changes in external and internal issues that are relevant to the anti-bribery management system. The review must contain the information on the performance of the anti-bribery management system, including trends in non-conformities and corrective actions, monitoring and measurement results, audit results, reports of bribery, investigations, and the nature and extent of the bribery risks faced by the organization. According to the clause 9.3.1, the top management review must include consideration of effectiveness of actions taken to address bribery risks and the opportunities for continual improvement of the anti-bribery management system. For more information about continual improvement, you can refer to clause 10.2 of the standard. Clause 9.3.1 further states that the outputs of the top management review must include decisions related to continual improvement opportunities and any need for changes to the anti-bribery management system. A summary of the results of the top management review must be reported to the governing body, if any. To cover the requirements of mandatory document, clause states that the organization must retain documented information as evidence of the results of top management reviews. Coming to subclause 9.3.2, governing body review, Clause 9.3.2 specifies that if the organization has a governing body, then it must undertake periodic reviews of the anti-bribery management system based on information provided by top management and the anti-bribery compliance function, and also any other information that the governing body requests or obtains. According to this clause, the organization must retain summary, documented information as evidence of the results of governing body reviews. Let's discuss subclause 9.4, review by anti-bribery compliance function. The subclause 9.4 of ISO 37001-2016 states that the anti-bribery compliance function must assess on a continual basis whether the anti-bribery management system is adequate to manage effectively the bribery risks faced by the organization and is being effectively implemented also. As per clause 9.4, the anti-bribery compliance function must report at planned intervals and on an ad hoc basis as appropriate to the governing body, if any, and the top management or to a suitable committee of the governing body or top management on the adequacy and implementation of the anti-bribery management system, including the results of investigations and audits. The clause 9.4 also stresses, as note 1, that the frequency of such reports depends on the organization's requirements, but is recommended to be at least annually. The clause also states under note 2 that the organization can use a business associate to assist in the review, as long as the business associate's observations are appropriately communicated to the anti-bribery compliance function, top management, and, as appropriate, the governing body, if any. Friends, we have now completed the Clause 9, Performance Evaluation of ISO 37001-2016. Now we shall discuss about Clause 10, Improvement. This clause requires organizations to determine and identify opportunities for continual improvement of the anti-bribery management system. The standard details actions that are required that cover handling of non-conformities. Should non-conformity be identified, organizations need to react promptly and take action. They need to identify whether similar non-conformities exist or could potentially occur and implement appropriate corrective action. The clause 10 has two subclauses. Subclause 10.1, non-conformity and corrective action, and subclause 10.2, continual improvement. Let me start with subclause 10.1, non-conformity and corrective action. The subclause 10.1 of the standard says that whenever non-conformity occurs, the organization must react promptly to the non-conformity, take action to control and correct it, and to deal with the consequences as applicable. The organization must evaluate the need for action to eliminate the causes of the non-conformity in order that it does not recur or occur elsewhere by reviewing the non-conformity, determining the causes of the non-conformity, and determining if similar non-conformities exist or could potentially occur. As per this clause, whenever non-conformity occurs, the organization must implement any action needed and also review the effectiveness of any corrective action taken to meet the requirements of the standard. The organization must make changes to the anti-bribery management system if necessary. The corrective actions taken by the organization must be appropriate to the effects of the non-conformities encountered. The organization must retain documented information as evidence of the nature of the non-conformities and any subsequent actions taken, and the results of any corrective action. It is also recommended under this clause to refer to Annexure A.20 for further guidance. Let's discuss now the final subclause 10.2 of the standard, that is continual improvement. The clause 10.2 of ISO 37001-2016 states that the organization must continually improve the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the anti-bribery management system. Continual improvement is a crucial aspect of the anti-bribery management system in the effort to achieve and maintain the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the anti-bribery management system as it relates to the objectives of the organizations. Organizations with operational anti-bribery management system must regularly attempt to improve their management system. It is difficult for organizations nor their context to remain static. Moreover, the risks to anti bribery management systems, as well as the methods of misusing them, are rapidly evolving. Eventually, there is no anti bribery management system that can remain perfect. It must act as a constant pace of improvement. However, an organization's context and internal dynamics remain the same. Continual improvement is just not a requirement of an anti bribery management system, but it's a need of every organization. To illustrate non-conformity or risk-related improvements, an analysis of anti-bribery management system components, which is based on the adequacy, suitability, and effectiveness criteria, may show that the component exceeds anti-bribery management system requirements or is incompetent. Changing the management system can often improve the anti-bribery management system. This subclause 10.2 continual improvement also recommends referring Annexure A.20 for guidance. The standard ISO 37001-2016 also provides a bibliography for more detailed information about various fundamentals, techniques, and requirements, etc. So, friends, now we have reached at the end of this session. I hope that you have an idea about ISO 37001 2016 Anti Bribery Management System, or ABMS in short. I sincerely thank you for all your interest and attention. Thanks and best wishes.